The British Empire, 1763 to 1914. That's the date range in this specification, and that's the date range we're going to look at throughout the series. So in this video, I'm basically going to give you somewhat of an introduction, an overview of some important topics within the specification, and for the other topics, I'm just going to list them. I'm going to focus mainly on trade and the Royal Navy, giving you a brief overview of them, but also I'm going to give you the context and the situation that the British Empire was in 1763, because that will help you understand the issues they faced and how the year of 1763 can be considered as somewhat of a stepping off point or a turning point. So in 1763, the 7 Years' War ended, and the British emerged victorious, defeating the French. So that meant that France lost all of its North American possessions, all of its North American territories east of the Mississippi. All this blue area here was lost as a result of the 7 Years' War, and most of that was gained by the British Empire, which results in another problem for the British, because it means they have more territory to defend. Now, wars are expensive, so the 7 Years' War left the British economy in basically a crisis. The treasury was nearly bankrupt. In 1763, the government debt was 157% of GDP, and it didn't stop there. In 1821, it was 260% of GDP. So the 7 Years' War, the outcome of it can be considered as somewhat of a Pyrrhic victory for the British Empire. Now, what's this fancy word, Pyrrhic? A Pyrrhic victory basically means that you've won, but at such a high cost that it wasn't really worth it. Okay, so the British Empire technically won the 7 Years' War, but one of the outcomes was their economy was in crisis, their national debt was extremely high, and they had more territories to defend. So the 7 Years' War can hardly be considered a victory for the British Empire in those terms. And in that sense, the 7 Years' War can be considered as a turning point in the British Empire. And also because, now this is not in the PowerPoint, but I'm just going to give you a brief explanation of it. Because of the 7 Years' War, as I said, the British government was in a lot of debt, so they had to find a way to fund it. So they started enforcing the taxes on the 13 colonies in America more severely, and obviously that's going to anger them. And that led to the phrase, no taxation without representation. And that was a very key factor in leading up to the American War of Independence. So these two phrases are very important and significant, and you should use them in your exam. Now, the wars do not stop there. The British Empire went through a series of wars throughout 1763 to 1914, and that just meant more government debt, more economic problems. So you have the American War of Independence, as I mentioned, the French Revolutionary Wars, and the Napoleonic Wars. Now, how were they able to survive with all these wars and government debt? They were able to survive because of trade. So trade was basically the lifeblood of the British Empire. Trade was the reason for the British Empire's survival throughout that period. And it was dependent on the government of the time. Now, what that means is that trade experienced lots of developments and changes from 1763 to 1914. And that is synonymous with what type of government was in power. For example, when the Whigs, which is basically a liberal party, were elected into Parliament, they started initiating the adoption of free trade. So government policy had somewhat of a symbiotic relationship with the development of trade, which means that basically one affects the other. Some key words here: protectionism and mercantilism. Now, if you study economics, you'll find my explanation of these two words very easy to understand. If you don't study economics, I'll try to simplify it for you. But remember that this is not this is not an economics test, it is a history test. So you're not going to need to explain any kind of economic theory here. You're just going to need to understand what these words mean so that you can use them in your essays. So protectionism, basically imposing trade barriers such as taxes and tariffs on imported goods. And that means that you protect your own domestic producers, because the goods produced within your country, within the British Empire, will be more price competitive than the goods imported from abroad, because if you impose taxes on imports, their prices will be higher. So consumers will favor cheaper goods. The cheaper goods will be the domestically produced goods within the British Empire. Mercantilism is linked to protectionism. Mercantilism is what was one of the dominant economic theories during the time, which meant that the British Empire saw trade as something that should benefit itself and only itself, and it advocated for the maintenance of a trade surplus, another economic term. A trade surplus basically occurs when the value of exports are larger than the value of imports. So if you're exporting goods, you're selling goods to the world, so you're gaining money. If you're importing goods, you're buying goods from abroad, so you're losing money. So basically, if the value of exports are bigger than the value of imports, it's somewhat of a profit in trade, and that's called a trade surplus. Okay, and protectionism helps to maintain that trade surplus. Now, other key points in the breadth topic of trade is the slave trade and the abolition of the slave trade, the Navigation Acts, the adoption of free trade, and all the ports and trade routes. So the slave trade, that should be kind of common knowledge for you. We'll go into that in more detail in another video. The adoption of free trade is basically transitioning from protectionism and mercantilism to free trade, so relying less on tariffs and trade barriers. The Navigation Acts were acts that were passed between 1651 and 1673, and they were basically acts that allowed the British Empire to maintain its ideology of protectionism and mercantilism. We'll go into them in more detail in another video. Basically, a significant change that occurred with the Navigation Acts as they were repealed. Now, ports, entrepôts, and trade routes. Entrepôts are basically a free port, so there are no tariffs, no trade barriers, no taxes on any imported goods. And the significance of these trade routes and ports for the British Empire is, as the British Empire acquired these trade routes and ports, they were able to expand and develop their trade with more areas around the world. So trade was allowed to flourish, basically. Now, the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy was heavily impacted by industrialization, the age of steam, and developments in shipbuilding. All three of these factors are interlinked. Okay, so as you can see here, we have a paddle and a steam engine. These were called hybrid ships, and they basically meant that you could switch between using the old-fashioned paddling method and using steam. So that's just one example of the impact of industrialization and the age of steam in, basically you can call them technological improvements in the Royal Navy. And so they allow the Royal Navy to maintain a dominant position across the seas, as they were consistently ahead of the other nations in terms of technological developments, and that made them more effective in combat. Piracy. The Royal Navy was also responsible for the suppression of piracy throughout this period, and piracy allowed development of the Royal Navy in the sense that in order to suppress piracy, you're going to need better ships than the pirates, so you're going to have an incentive to develop the ships and the power of the Royal Navy. Captain Cook and his exploration and the acquisition of strategic bases. So Captain Cook circumnavigated the globe between 1768 and 1771, allowing the British Empire to discover new territories previously unknown to it, including Australia. And so that allowed them to, first of all, navigate more effectively, and also it allowed them to expand their naval presence across the world, and thereby expanding the presence of the Royal Navy. The acquisition of strategic bases like Gibraltar, Malta, and Ceylon, it allowed the British Empire to have strategic footholds around the world to place their Royal Navy ships. Now, this is very important. The Royal Navy had a symbiotic relationship with trade. So as trade developed and changed, the Royal Navy developed and changed. For example, the Royal Navy was responsible for, first of all, protecting and then suppressing the slave trade, after it was abolished. And it was also responsible for protecting British commerce and traded goods that were transported across the trade routes. And also, by suppressing piracy, they were able to defend and protect British trade interests in certain areas, especially in the Straits of Malacca, which are around this area in Indonesia. Other topics, now, what we discuss, the Royal Navy and trade, are what we call breadth topics. They're more focused on change and continuity of trade and the Royal Navy between the years 1763 and 1914. These depth topics, you're supposed to know them in more detail, and specifically cause, significance, and consequence. So I'm just gonna list them here. Okay, this is taken directly from the specification. If you want to have a quick read of them, pause the video, because I'm not going to read all this out. So you have the loss of the American colonies, the birth of British Australia, the British presence in Canada and India, and the importance of the Nile Valley. Alright, this has been the Awesome Tutor. Bye.